childhood at the little brown church in the bay. Oh, come, 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 come to the church in the Wadsworth. Oh, come to the church in the dale. You know the spot is so dear to my childhood at the little brown church in the bay.
Welcome to In Touch. I'm Lucy Sondels. Well, the film you just saw and the music were brought to you compliments of David Rodich. He's here today as our guest to speak about the churches in Wadsworth and the history of those churches.
Well, Lucy, what we saw in our opening was a scene outside the Grace Lutheran Church of Wadsworth, about 1936 or 1937, showing the parishioners coming out at the close of a Sunday service. And this is also part of a film that was taken by Stanley Parker, that we've talked about before, and who has shared many of his films with us previous to his death in January. I thought that it would be interesting to take a look at some of the churches in Wadsworth, since they do play such an important role in our lives. And we're going to be focusing on the Protestant churches, since although we do have people of other faiths living within our community, the houses of worship which stand in Wadsworth are those of the Protestant denominations. Now, when the settlers first came to this area, we mentioned on previous shows that they came basically from New England. And the idea of education and religion were very strong in their background. So one of the first things they did was to establish a school in which their children could be educated. And this school would also be used for church services. The first church services in Wadsworth were held in 1815 in the log cabin of Oliver Durham, who was one of the original settlers of Wadsworth, and they were conducted by Salmon Warner, who was a father-in-law to Durham and a brother-in-law of Benjamin Dean, whose son Benjamin felled the first tree in Wadsworth in 1814. Salmon Warner was a deeply religious man and was respected by all who knew him, and in fact was referred to in the community as Father Warner. After he moved his family here in 1815, they began religious services on a regular basis. And later that year, the next year in 1816, the Browns arrived in town. And we've talked previously about Judge Brown and his influence on this community, Judge Brown being an uncle of the abolitionist John Brown, who lived in Hudson. And the Browns were Congregationalists. And one of the first things that he demanded of Salmon Warner was, "Who are you and what are you doing?" And Salmon Warner explained that they were Methodists and that they were doing their best to keep religious services together, and invited the Congregationalists to join them. And so for quite some time, services were conducted jointly and harmoniously, until unfortunately other people joined their little band, and as often happens in such organizations, arguments over points of theology came about. And in December of 1816, December 8th, the Methodists withdrew to form their own class, that being the first church formed within the present-day Wadsworth. And it's also the first Methodist church in Medina County, and it exists to this day, now as the United Methodist Church. Now, these congregations continued to, or these people continued to have religious services, and then in 1819, the Congregationalists pulled away from the other groups and formed their own church. And then in 1821, the Baptists formed their own organization. Now, the Baptists, as we'll see in a little bit, is different than what we would think of Baptists today. We have some photographs that might help illustrate the transitions that some of our churches in Wadsworth have experienced through the years. The first picture we have is of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, as I say, they met in the schoolhouses on alternate Sundays with the other congregations until 1835, when the Methodists were able to build their first house of worship on Main Street, just south of the present Central School. And the church building at that time consisted only of the rear portion of this building. You can see that part of the roof is lighter in color than the rest of it. And that's because in 1867, a 15-foot addition was built to the front or west side of the church, and this steeple, which is 100 feet high, was added to the church. The steeple is surmounted, you can barely see at the top there, by a weather vane of the angel Gabriel blowing his trumpet on resurrection morn. It was carved out of a 5-foot block of solid block of wood by Captain A.P. Steele, who was a devoted member of the Methodist Church and a prominent citizen here in Wadsworth. And the officials are gathered in front of the church, evidently for the dedication photograph. Now, something that I guess I wasn't much of a detective because I didn't notice originally, that this could not have been taken on that Sunday when the church was dedicated, because if you notice, the neighbor lady has her laundry out on the line. So they must have had the photograph taken the day after. And this having been taken in December of 1867 would have been one of the earliest photographs that Captain Woolbaugh took. He arrived here, as we recall, in 1865, but this is one of the earliest evidences that we have of his work.
That's wonderful. Did you find this at one of your...
That came, in fact, in one of the first boxes of photographs I ever received from the Hilliard family. Now, the Hilliards were not members of the Methodist Church, but they were very interested in history. J.B. Hilliard, who was the founder of the Hilliard Funeral Home, and was a friend of Captain Woolbaugh, and in fact later purchased the contents of the captain's house following Captain Woolbaugh's death in 1828. So they had a very large collection of photographs, and this happened to be in that collection, part of that collection that was given to me.
Oh, how nice.
Now, the next picture is of the pastor's class of the Methodist Church in 1893, and seated in the front is the Reverend F.G. McCulley. Now, Franklin McCulley, ministers weren't paid very well back in those days, and it was necessary for them oftentimes to have outside employment in order to sustain their family. And Franklin McCulley was one of the founders of the Wadsworth Telephone Company. It was at one time called the General Electric Company, but was later called the Wadsworth Telephone Company, and they are the ones who brought telephone service to Wadsworth. And he is seated next to Lucius Nelson Hard, who himself was the writer of memoirs of his boyhood in Wadsworth. He was a pioneer, and was a architect and builder of some of the finer homes in town, including Dr. Lyman's home, diagonally across from the post office, where President McKinley gave one of his famous front porch speeches, and several other homes in town. The building that now houses Country Expression on Main Street. And we've talked about him before as being a master builder and a very prominent citizen. And all of the people that you see in the picture there were members of that pastor's class.
Was this taken at a photographer's studio?
Yes, you can tell by the distinctive scenery in back. That's one of the hallmarks. Even though this photograph is not marked with Captain Woolbaugh's name, the background indicates that it was taken in his studio.
It's like they're in an opera house to me.
And in fact, the notation of the names, which is on the back of the photograph, are made in Captain Woolbaugh's handwriting, so it's another indication.
Well, I guess you can't get a good view of that at all.
Now, he made the...
You've come to recognize his handwriting.
Well, he made the notation in 1923, at which time he would have been, what, 50, about almost 80 years old. But he made the notation of the names, thankfully for us.
Yeah. Okay, and next we have?
Now, at that same time, in 1893, or right around that same time, the church had expanded, and it was necessary to place a basement underneath it. And this is a group of the workmen who were gathered outside of the church, and also of the women who were there to do what women are supposed to do, cook. I've got a feeling I'm going to get hit by a shovel any moment.
No, just these photographs, that's all.
And the pastor of the church at that time was over on the left, next to Tom Screen, who was also in that earlier picture, a Civil War veteran and mayor of Wadsworth. And any time you show someone an old photograph of Wadsworth and it has an elderly man with a white beard, people insist it's Tom Screen because of his well-known appearance, whether it is in fact or not. Now, Tom Screen was a member of that church, of the Methodist Church, until his death, but in his later years became very hard of hearing and would sit down front with all the other widowers. And unfortunately, like a lot of hard of hearing people, he didn't realize the level of his voice, and would often make remarks about other people in the congregation or about the pastor's sermon in what he thought was a whisper but could be heard in all the recesses of the church. But he was still a beloved character. His home was located on High Street, where the First National or Huntington Bank is now. This is a picture of the Methodist Church shortly before it was raised in 1903 to make way for a new building. You see Gabriel still perched up on top there, And in the belfry, I don't know if we can pick it up on the camera, just barely, you can see there are two men in there.
Oh.
And one of them is Fred Liebert, who was later the custodian or the janitor or sexton of the church, and the other one was Harry Griesmer, who was a well-known man here in town, and his descendants are still living in Wadsworth today. But that was the final picture taken of the church before it was torn down in 1903.
Okay.
Now, this picture ought to be familiar to a lot of our residents today, as this structure being the annex to the Central Middle School on Main Street. And this building was built in 1903 to replace the frame structure we just saw. The architect for this building was Millard P. Rush of Akron, who was also the architect for the E.J. Young Mansion that we've talked about previously, and also the home of William Artman, who was the General Secretary for the Ohio Companies and President of the First National Bank, whose home was located a little further south on Main Street. The picture really doesn't do it justice. The brick originally was a beautiful red and pink mottled color, and the stained glass windows were fantastic. Now, when it was necessary for the Methodists to find a larger home, they made arrangements to sell this building to the Christian Missionary Alliance congregation, which had been meeting in the Tabernacle down in the Grove. And at that time, in the agreement, the only window that they asked to take with them was this one in the north vestibule, which depicts that original frame church that we saw earlier. However, at that time, World War II broke out, and the Methodists were unable to get building supplies, and the other congregation had to move. The Christian Missionary Alliance had to move. They had to find other quarters because their lease had expired on the Tabernacle. And so that deal fell through. And at the end of the war, when the Methodists built their new church on Broad Street, this building was sold to the Board of Education. And the Board of Education gave them the privilege of taking any of the windows that they wanted as long as they would replace them with regular glass. And the only ones that the Methodists took, and somewhat grudgingly I might say, was the center panel of this large front window, which depicts Christ as the Good Shepherd. And this was installed in the Broad Street building. But all of the other windows were left there. And over the years, they were vandalized. People threw rocks through them. And I can remember when I was in junior high school at Central, we had study hall in what had been the sanctuary of that building. And at that time, the windows had been boarded over on the outside, but they were still exposed on the inside. And many of them had holes in them. And it was, you could even then, though, see how beautiful they must have been. Later, when they remodeled the building for home economics purposes, they paneled over on the inside. When I was in high school, I began a history committee at the Methodist Church in an effort to preserve different records. I bet you're surprised that I was interested in the history of my church. In fact, that's, as we've talked before, one of the ways that I became interested in city history. Though my interest had existed previous to that, I hadn't done anything practical with it. But in doing research on one of our ministers, the Reverend Thomas Browning, who was also twice mayor of Wadsworth, I decided that it would be interesting to include in the church history some aspects of his work as mayor. And so when I attempted to locate the city records, I was told that they'd either been thrown out or lost. Finally, I located them in the attic of the old powerhouse, between the rafters and the roof, and the rain was leaking on them. And at that time, I approached J.D. Henson, who was mayor, and asked him what could be done about this situation. And as usually happens when you complain about something, you get put in charge of it. And so I had the job of salvaging those records. But to get back to the church, one of the projects that I undertook as chairman of the history committee for our church was the removal of some of these windows. And the Board of Education was totally agreeable to this, again, as long as we put things back in a decent condition. Unfortunately, we removed several of the windows and got them as far as the church, and there wasn't too much interest in it. And we stopped taking out the windows. Now, that same history committee, under the chairmanship of Lois Aker, has made wonderful strides towards taking out more windows and having them restored, and several of these have been prominently displayed around the church building.
So the church has the windows that were removed originally?
Not all of them, but some of them. Unfortunately, some of the ones that I had removed, particularly one on the south side of the building, which depicted Willis Struggles, who was the son of our pastor in the 1880s, who had died during the Spanish-American War. And it depicted him as a soldier boy in front of a tent and a flag. And though it was a picture of him, it actually represented all of the servicemen of Wadsworth. And unfortunately, that was one of the windows that has disappeared. When as an aside, I might tell you, when I was first told about that window, I assumed that it was just a sketch or a painting of him on glass. But in fact, they had gone to Captain Wilbaugh and gotten a photograph of Willis Struggles and had this reproduced on glass. So it was actually, if you had known him, it was actually his likeness. But that's one of the windows that's missing now.
You think it's still in the area, or do you think it's been, who knows, sold elsewhere?
I don't know. But as I say, Mrs. Aker and her committee have done wonderful work now in trying to preserve what windows remain, and there are still some more that are to be taken out. That building down the road is slated to be demolished after the addition to Central School is completed, and it will probably be demolished for parking. And so they hope to get the rest of those windows out before that time. In fact, one of the last times I was in the cellar of that building, the old large-style furnace pipes, Fred Liebert that we saw in the belfry in an earlier photograph, when he was sexton to the church, would mark on the furnace pipe every Sunday what the weather conditions were and little commentaries of the day.
A diary on a pipe.
And I don't know if that's ever been replaced or covered over, but if not, I think that hunk of pipe would be a piece of history in itself. Now, this picture was taken in July of 1914. A gentleman from England, who was the man on the right porch with the white beard, had come to have an organ recital for the congregation. And the men of the church took this as an opportunity to have their photograph taken. And you can see there are probably 100 or 200 people in the picture, so I wouldn't try to identify them all, and I couldn't identify many of them. But they were all prominent men of the day. And if you, I don't know if it'll show up on camera, but you see, this is Dr. Morrison Everhard there.
We can't see your finger in it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
All right, let me move. There we go.
Dr. Morrison Everhard, who was a doctor in Wadsworth and later moved to New Philadelphia, Ohio, and was a member of the Board of Education. We've seen him in pictures previously. Up there. But over his shoulder, there's a white dot, and it doesn't look like much on camera, but what that is a lady's dress. And apparently a woman had accidentally wandered out on the porch, and so they had to black her out with ink and the rest of it, but there's a little bit of her white dress showing.
That also shows a nice picture of the window, too.
It does. It was a beautiful, beautiful window. In fact, boy, I always get myself in trouble. There was a particular woman who was a member of the congregation in the early decades of this century, and she's long since gone. But one evening at an evening service, of course, back in those days, churches generally had 1 or 2 morning services and then an evening service on Sunday and then a service on Wednesday evening. And during a particularly rousing moment in the service, she noticed the light, the way it was the setting sun was falling through the depiction of Christ, and it just struck her so that she fell to her knees and began to praise the window, and in fact had to be led out of the church and was never quite right mentally again, which is a sad story, but it gives evidence to the fact that it was a very beautiful window, and remains so today. It still is in the foyer of the present Methodist Church.
Okay.
Now, this building looks like something that ought to be up around the square in Hudson. And we have to remember that having been settled by New Englanders, much of the downtown area of Wadsworth originally looked like downtown Hudson. The salt box type houses, the little businesses with the little shop signs out front of it. And this was the home of the Congregationalists. It was built in 1842, and by George Hinsdale. He was the architect for it. And the Congregationalists worshipped in this edifice until 1885, when they had pretty much died out. Most of the New Englanders, the families had decreased, and those that remained moved further west, the pioneering spirit still being strong within them. And so this building sat vacant for 8 years until 1893, when it was taken over by the Mennonite congregation.
Okay. And next we have?
This man is the Reverend Ephraim Huntsberger, who was called from Pennsylvania in 1852 to take charge of the Mennonite congregation, which had been formed the previous year. It was largely through his efforts that they were able to build their first building.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem. Sorry, that's the next picture.
Here we go.
Which originally was located on the diagonal road, which is, we'd now call it Wadsworth Road, across from the present-day hospital. In fact, if you go back in that area near the allotment, you can see that their cemetery still exists. Unfortunately, as times changed and Reverend Huntsberger became older, he was no longer able to keep up with the changing styles and demands on his energies. And so the congregation was taken over in 1893 by his son-in-law, Reverend Hershey, who moved the congregation to the center of town, taking over that Congregationalist church that we saw a moment ago, and began preaching sermons in English. Up to that time, they had all been in German. And this encouraged a lot of the younger people to participate in church activities. Reverend Hershey remained as pastor of the church until 1901, when he left Wadsworth to become the first president of Bluffton College.
Oh, my.
Now, also in 1842, at the same time that this Congregationalist church was being built, the Disciple Church was also built on High Street. Now, we talked earlier about the Baptists having broken away from that small band that had originally met in homes and schoolhouses in 1821. In 1823, their ideas had sufficiently changed from what at that time had been called the Baptist denomination that they voted to join the Disciples of Christ denomination. And it exists as part of that denomination to this day. Though we would refer to it as the First Christian Church, many people still call it the Disciple Church because it is part of that denomination. It was from the front porch of this edifice that James Garfield, who had been, I was going to say itinerant, that's not the word I want, but he had filled in at different pastorates in the area and had preached many times for the disciples in Wadsworth. And when the Civil War broke out and he was attempting to raise a group to follow him into battle, he enlisted soldiers from the front steps of the First Christian Church. And when James Garfield died at the hands of an assassin in 1881, it was the bell of the First Christian Church, or the Disciple Church, that was tolled in his memory. And in fact, it was a former pastor of this church who was the one to give the principal address at the time of Garfield's burial. He and Garfield had had an agreement that whichever one would die first, the other would preach their funeral service. So when Garfield was assassinated, Reverend Rao had the honor of preaching his eulogy.
Okay.
This is a group of men of the Disciple Church, or the First Christian Church, in 1916. And they've all gathered on a Sunday morning. You can see the cars in the background. They're preparing to go to Akron to have worship services at the church in Akron as a group. And Captain Woolbaugh, always ready with his camera, was out there to take their photograph. Of course, this was just across Boyer Street from Captain Woolbaugh's home, so perhaps it's a little bit handier.
Yeah, quite a group.
Now, this is a group of women, a Sunday school class of young ladies from the Disciple Church. Now, this is the type of thing that unless you do a little bit of research or unless you're able to recognize the people, you might be confused, because you see in the background Trinity Church.
Yeah.
But apparently the sun must have been better there. So they're in the side lawn of the Disciple Church, and these women had competed in 1919 in a contest in Medina with the Medina Bible School, and they were victorious. And so again, they sat for their photograph. Now, how many of these people can you name?
Of these that we see right now? None.
Obviously, this picture would have to be blown up many, many times for even a person with good eyesight to be able to identify all of the members of the congregation. But in the following pictures we have, people who are longtime residents of Wadsworth might be able to recognize some of the others.
You'd have to tell me that picture had people in it. My eyes aren't that good.
This is the men's group from the First Christian Church. You'll notice the difference in windows. They had been remodeled in 1913, and those Gothic windows that we saw in the earlier picture were removed, and the church was modernized. During subsequent remodelings, they've attempted to, as much as possible, take it back to its original state. Fortunately for me, some of the people of the Sunday school classes, the adult Sunday school classes of the First Christian Church, have helped me in compiling a list of most of the people. Yes, most of the people that appear in that picture.
Okay.
And this is the ladies' group at the church at the same time.
And this was about?
Well, by the cloche hats, I would say probably in the very late 20s or very early 30s. These last 4 photographs, the previous 3 and this one that we've looked at, are not by Captain Woolbaugh, but are in fact by Earl Days.
Okay.
Or Glenn Freeborn, one of the 2.
Cover yourself here, right?
Well, I said Earl Days, and then I noticed they're not marked, and all of Mr. Days' frames were marked, and he was connected with that congregation, so I would say either that or Glenn Freeborn, who was a member of the church and was a amateur photographer also. Now, when we made our tour around the area last fall, and we stopped at the High Church down in Wayne County, I talked about the Pennsylvania Dutch settlement coming into that area and how generally they were of the either Lutheran or Reformed denominations, and that in later years, as these New Englanders died out or migrated west, the Pennsylvania Dutch community grew and migrated north into the center of Wadsworth and founded their own churches. And one of these was the Reformed Church, which began originally in 1858, and they purchased as their home the old octagonal academy that we've talked about before. It was built in the 1830s, 1838, 39, for John McGregor to teach his academy there. And he was followed by several other teachers, and then the building sat vacant for a number of years and fell into disrepair. And at the time that the Long Schoolhouse was located across the street where Young Fellows is now, when the children would have recess on rainy days, they would go over and play in that schoolhouse, which was supposed to be haunted. And oftentimes they would hear strange rappings and noises, most of which were provided by the boys outside the window. But this was the first home for the Trinity Church, which was called for a short time St. Paul's, but later they adopted the name Trinity Reformed Church of Wadsworth, and it was by that name that they're known to this day. This building, there's some controversy as to what eventually happened to it. It was moved to the corner, the southwest corner of North Lyman and Prospect Street, and was later occupied by a group called the Church of God. But sometime in the 1890s, it disappeared. It was either torn down, or some people maintain that it was moved down to southern Ohio to house another congregation.
Okay, and this gentleman?
Now, in the first 6 years that Trinity existed, it was served by 4 different pastors until the Reverend Dr. Sebastian Goss received the call. And you might be a little bit confused by the military medals on his jacket, but in fact, Reverend Goss had been a veteran of the Civil War, and those are his Civil War medals that he has on there. But he was pastor of this church until his retirement in 1900, and has a terrific record as far as the community is concerned, as service to the congregation and to the community. He left his position at Trinity to become Chancellor of Heidelberg College, but unfortunately, after about a year or 2 in that position, ill health forced him to resign, and he died a year or so later.
Yeah. Also in that photograph, you can tell that it's from T.D. Woolbaugh.
T.D. Woolbaugh.
Yeah. I never really knew how it was spelled.
Well, now this side
of,
it's a good German name. This size of photograph is referred to as a cabinet photograph, and some of them are very ornate with scalloped edges, and many of them have gilding around the edges. And the captain's stamp or his identification on there, his, you might say, logo, is quite different on all of them, and sometimes it's on the back, but it's always very decorative.
That's very nice.
And it's amazing. Now, that photograph, Dr. Goss is a very young man in that photograph, or middle-aged man at least, so that was probably taken in the 1870s. And it's remarkable what
The quality?
condition that
Yes,
is.
mhm.
Now, it was during Dr. Goss's pastorate that the second building to house the Trinity congregation was built. And it was this building in 1873 on the same site.
Mhm.
You see it's large. Now, following the example at that time, which we'll also see in our later pictures of the Lutheran congregation, generally the first floor was reserved for Sunday school purposes or meeting room, and the sanctuary itself was on the second floor.
Oh, I didn't know
And that was following the German tradition.
Oh,
This picture they just call the spring cleaners. It was taken about 1890, inside the Trinity Church, the one that we just looked at,
oh my.
and they've been doing their spring cleaning. And actually, I've heard elsewhere that it's supposed to be a ladies' aid type function,
Oh, I see.
but they always call it the spring cleaners. And the Reverend Dr. Goss is seen in the back row, and there are very many of the prominent people of the time.
Well, it's quite an interior.
It is, with the
Yeah.
decorations painted on the back, and it's heavily wallpapered, and the gas chandeliers, and the organ
Oh, the
in the
organ
back
is
recess,
immense.
and the carpeting going up into the chancel area.
Very awe-inspiring, is that the word?
Now, this is a picture of the same sanctuary, but you notice the organ is not there. Out of the range of the picture, there's an organ, pump organ off to the side before they were able to get a pipe organ. And this evidently must have been some type of a harvest feast that they were having, or harvest celebration.
Okay.
And this is a picture that we've looked at once before, just showing that same sanctuary, looking from the balcony, seeing it decorated for Christmas. It's a little dark, not only because of its age, but also because natural light had to be used, and you can see some reflections from the windows up on top on the back of the picture. This is a picture of the Ladies Missionary Society, also of the Trinity Church.
Okay. This is a series of
Now,
photographs.
this one
I'm not
is-
sure if I'm holding
This
them
is a
correctly.
composite made up, if we can start this way, please, and
Okay.
then turn it, is a composite made up of 4 shots, and it's all printed on one. But when it was necessary for the Trinity congregation to build a new building, the old building was dismantled, the siding was taken off, and the rest of the structure was taken down. And what was the lumber that was taken from it was used in the construction of Wadsworth's first apartment house, which we talked about when we visited Durling Park and Humboldt Avenue last fall. And that was for many years called the Pumpkin because of the garish yellow color that it was painted. And it was built by John O'Lacey, who was one of the developers of Humboldt Avenue. And if we look at the photograph, we can see them starting to pull down one of the towers.
yeah.
And if we turn this
Okay.
way, we can see the debris
Debris
off to
fall.
the side.
Was that an event that people came and observed? I don't
I would
see any people
imagine,
here.
no, normally you think something like that would
Mhm.
gather quite a crowd unless they were just out of camera range. But this was a series of 4 postcards that,
Oh, I see that you had photographs.
right, and they just put them all together. That apartment house existed until about 1963 when it was purposely burned down to make way for a parking lot for the Christian Missionary Alliance Church.
And they always recycled their things.
They didn't
Yeah,
throw
which
things
were-
away the way
no.
we do now.
Yeah.
Now, that building was replaced by this structure, which again ought to look a little familiar to present-day residents of Wadsworth. It was built in 1912, and it has a Spanish-Italian influence to it. But you notice it has the large stairs going up the front, which in the last renovation that was done to Trinity, the last enlargement, those stairs were removed, and there are now stained glass windows where the doors were formerly.
That's a beautiful photograph.
And these are some of the workmen who are standing there. You can tell the church has not yet been completed. And down in the front, you have Levi Leatherman, who was the man responsible for delivering the wood for the building project. The Leathermans owned the lumber company at that time. And the Reverend G.T.N. Beam, who was pastor of the church, holding what appears to be a cigar. I didn't know they smoked back then. And his brother was also pastor of the church at one time. And over on the right-hand side is Stephen Hartzell, who followed William Artman as president of the First National Bank, and obviously was a partner in the Allen and Hartzell real estate business. In the back is Delbert Minnick there, and the back side over here is George Chandler, who is one of the other workmen. Unfortunately, the other people in the picture have not yet been identified.
Okay, and next?
Now, many of the people who worked on the railroad were of Irish descent, or were Irish, in fact. Because of difficulties in trying to get the railroad finished, the project dragged on and on and on. And then just about the time it looked like they were going to be able to complete it, the workers went on strike. And so the owners of the railroad went to Canada and to Ireland to hire workers. And because of the desperate times then in Ireland, many people eagerly came here to work on the railroad. Once the railroad was completed, many of these people stayed on to work in the coal mines in the area surrounding Wadsworth. Many of these Irishmen were of the Catholic denomination, but there was no place, no area here where they could worship, and many of them had to walk to Doylestown on Sunday to worship at St. Peter's and Paul. Finally, services were held in Wadsworth in the Gallagher farmhouse, which is pictured here. Now this area, you can see the trees and so forth have all been knocked down in the outbuildings. This is just as they're about to develop the 10-acre Gallagher farm into what we would now call Humboldt Avenue. And we talked about one of this on a previous show. And in fact, you can see the back end of the Catholic church there. But before that church was built, services were held in the Gallagher house. Then, beginning in 1880, the Catholic congregation was formed here in Wadsworth, and this mission-style church was built on Broad Street on the same site where the present church is. In fact, when the present church was built in 1929, they moved this building off to the side and continued to hold services there until their brick building was completed. Then this building was dismantled, much in the way that we saw that the Trinity Church had been, and the lumber from this was used in the construction of the house at the corner of Broad Street and Durling Drive.
Oh, my heavens.
And this is just a social gathering about 1920 on the front lawn of the Sacred Heart Church.
It's interesting that they did not move the site away from where they first worshipped.
No? Well, and again, when we
That's similar to all the churches at
when we talked about the Methodist Church, I don't know if it was frugality or sentimentality, but the Methodists worshipped on the same location from 1835 until 1951 when they moved to Broad Street. And that was before my time, but I'm sure there were not a few dry eyes in the house at having to leave their old church home. There's a church building of necessity has lavished upon it so much love and attention, and so many of the important activities of a Christian life take place in that. Your baptism, your Sunday school, your potluck dinners,
and
marriages, funerals, there's a lot of memories there. And when a church burns down, I know of a gentleman in Akron who heard a report on the radio that a church was burning on High Street in Akron, and he ran about 12 blocks thinking that it was his church, and unfortunately it was the congregation next door, but he was much relieved that it was not his, because a church is a very personal thing in the life of someone who is religiously inclined. Now in 1929, Sacred Heart replaced the earlier mission church with this brick building. And again, it's obviously on the same site. It's the same building that's there now, though the later addition had not yet been made.
That's right.
Now, the Lutherans had organized in 1885, and they had several different pastors before calling the Reverend Dr. Kaufman to come to Wadsworth and preach for them. And he agreed to do so if he was to be allowed to preach in German. And they consented to this and came. And this is a picture of the Reverend Dr. Kaufman and his family.
7 children.
This is another thing, an opportunity to point out the extent of the work that Captain Woolbaugh did in this town over 60 years of photographing generations of people. He would photograph people from the time they were babies, and then when they bring in their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And consequently, he knew everyone in town, and that's why his diaries are so valuable to us. Only 4 volumes of them still exist. All the rest of them we managed to throw out, along with hundreds of thousands of his photographs and all of his negatives.
And you have those diaries?
The 4 volumes,
The 4
yes.
volumes, yes, not all of them.
Now, as I say, the church was formed in 1885, and in 1886, this building was dedicated, the Grace Evangelical and Reformed Church. Now, I should point out the ladies in front are not members of the church necessarily, but are in fact the Women's Relief Corps of the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. They're the wives of the Civil War veterans, and they've just served a dinner in the church hall, and just happened to be posed outside of the church. But it is a good shot of the church itself. And again, above the door over here that's opened, it can't be seen on television, but it says lecture room. And as I pointed out with the Trinity picture, a lecture room or Sunday school room was on the ground floor, and then the sanctuary was on the upper level. And that was following the German tradition. In 1916, the building we just saw was replaced by this building, due largely through the efforts of E.J. Young, who acted as chairman of the building committee, saving them the need for an outside general contractor, and also Dr. and Mrs. Everhard, who contributed largely to the efforts. Something that's interesting here, from the way the building appears now, are the towers, which, as you can see, are quite elaborate. And in the French tradition have the little gargoyles coming off and all sorts of little things, and the towers are open. And in fact, the band that used to play in the steeple of the old Lutheran church did play once or twice in those steeples. But unfortunately, later in the 1950s, because of deterioration of the stonework, it was necessary to enclose those towers and take off a lot of the artistic detail. But it's still a beautiful, beautiful building.
Okay.
And this last picture, now this picture was taken in front of the First Christian Church, which could fool you, fooled me. But in fact, it's not members of the First Christian Church. It's the Jerusalem Lutheran Church, which were having a district meeting. And these men were the members of the church council at that time, and they posed in front of the First Christian Church.
Well, how did you find that this was not members of the First Christian congregation?
Well, I suspicion that it wasn't, because I recognized several people in the photograph, and I never knew their families to be members there. And then I found, back at the time the photograph was taken, that it appeared in the newspaper, and I saw the names. The history behind it.
I was just curious.
But churches generate a lot of memorabilia, a lot of little artifacts. Every Sunday you go to church and they give you a bulletin, and usually after you read it or make a note about meetings or who's in the hospital, you throw it away. Unfortunately, my church, the Methodist Church, seems to have been very lacking in. I would like to think we used all of our resources for missionary work or something, rather than making souvenirs. So we find very few. Most of the ones come to us from either the Reformed Church or the Lutheran Church. That might also be because I received 2 large collections from people who happen to be members, very active and members of that church. But we do have some souvenirs that we can look at from different churches, and the first one is from the Methodist Church, called The Womanless Wedding. Now, this was produced by an outside company, but it was for the benefit of the Methodist Builders' Aid. Almost from the time that Main Street church was finished in 1903, it was overgrown. And so many, many efforts were instituted to raise money towards a new building. In fact, it was at that time that the ladies of the Methodist Church began serving the Rotary dinners, which they do to this day in order to raise money. But out of all the people, out of all the people who are listed there, who had the different parts, I could only find a half dozen of them, only 6 of them that are still living. And this is a brochure from the cornerstone laying ceremony, a program from it, of that new building in 1951 on the site of the E.J. Young Mansion that we talked about earlier.
Okay. Can I just flip this over then? I noticed there's something on
Sure.
the back. I don't know if this is out of order.
I think this is what is known in the trade as an advertisement.
Ah,
It was a publication that was put out in the early 60s, simply to inform
mhm,
prospective members of the
Mhm.
community about the work of the church and inviting their
Mhm.
questions and membership.
okay.
Now, we've had a lot of people from Wadsworth in all different denominations who've gone on and followed into the ministry. They've grown up in the local church and they've gone into the ministry. This happens to be a bulletin or a program from the service of ordination for Darrell Higgins, who was a Wadsworth boy, graduate of Wadsworth High School, and was a member of the Methodist Church. And one of the Sunday school classes of the Methodist Church had a scholarship fund, and it was largely through the use of that scholarship fund that he was able to be educated in the ministry. However, once he was educated in the ministry, he became a pastor of the United Church of Christ, which I don't know
Whoa.
if that means anything or not, but the ceremony was held at our church. This is an example of community worship. The little card on the left is a reminder for the Union Memorial Service in 1931 at the high school auditorium, and it's directed particularly towards the American
Mhm,
Legion.
mhm.
They remind everyone to bring their cap.
Oh.
And on the right is a Good Friday service, and it's been tradition in Wadsworth that all of the churches come together for
Mhm.
Good Friday and have one service preached by usually the newest pastor to town, and it's held at a different church on a rotation basis.
They picked the newest guy, huh? Oh, let me flip this over. There's something here on the back.
This is another Good Friday service. In fact, it might even be the same one. 1931. And this
Mhm.
one was held at Trinity Church.
Okay.
And all the different members of the community would participate in some way. Now, we saw earlier the picture that I referred to as a harvest service or a
Mhm.
harvest home. And this is a little
Oh, I see.
card from the Trinity Church in 1878 inviting people to their harvest home, which was held in Halderman's Grove, which is about 4 miles west of, or north of
Mhm,
Western
mhm.
Star. And we know where Western Star is, don't we?
Yes, we do now.
All right. And over here is another
Mhm.
Trinity church program.
Okay. And then just,
Sure. This is Topics for Prayer Meetings in 1886. This also comes from the Trinity Church.
can you read any of those? I can't read them all.
Oh, gee.
Just to give two or
The
three.
Good Fight of Faith, God's Sympathy with His People, Jesus Weeping Over Sinners, and Trusting and Working. Those were the programs for January of that year. And then they had a pledge down at the bottom that you would sign, that you would faithfully
Oh, I
attend and
see.
try to put into practice the things that you were learning at the different services.
So they had it all in writing, huh?
And this is called the Reformed Pastoral, which also obviously comes from the Reformed Church, 1887. And you might say it's an early version of a newsletter. I know the Lutheran Church here in Wadsworth has one that is called the Grace Notes. Our Methodist Church has one called the Circuit Writer, hearkening back to the
Mhm,
circuit writing
mhm,
days of our
mhm.
early pastors. And most of the churches do have some type of a bulletin or a newsletter that helps to keep their members informed about
Mhm,
different
mhm.
activities within the church.
Okay, and I'll just flip this over too. Okay.
And that, again, is just another service that was held there in 1887.
Okay.
Many of these things that I receive or purchase at auctions, I put into covers like this. And normally they're not loose, of course, they're in albums. But I took these pages out just as a sampling of
Mhm.
what exists out there. This is a program from the dedication service of that Trinity Church in 1914.
Okay.
It was built in 1912 and it was dedicated in 1914.
Then on the reverse, you have here.
Their
the-
85th anniversary
Mhm.
in 1943. And their 90th anniversary in 1948.
This will inspire people of other denominations to leave their memorabilia
Well,
too.
I honestly didn't realize that I had so many
I'm going to read verses.
that pertain to Trinity there all together, but I just pulled some pages out
Mhm.
of a book, and I guess I pulled out all one section. But now this is their 125th anniversary in 1983, and of course it shows those different
the
churches
churches.
that we talked about previously, showing how they've grown through the years. Now this is, for many years, we had a Presbyterian fellowship here in Wadsworth, and it was their intention to eventually build a church, and it is my understanding they have now ceased to meet. I believe their property has been sold. They never actually constructed a building of their own, but were very active in the community for quite a number of years. And this is just a little brochure on their activities and on their denomination for prospective members.
Yeah, on the reverse of this, you have something from Sacred Heart.
Oh, well, that's a catechism.
Yeah.
Prayers for the morning and evening. Boy, we could all use those.
Okay.
And this is just opening day services for the Church of Christ, as opposed to the United Church of Christ, which is on Westgood Avenue. And in fact, they've expanded their building greatly since the photograph there, but they still are on Westgood Avenue.
Okay, and on the back you have here.
Oh, that is a program from an anniversary of the Church of the Nazarene. Now, the Church of the Nazarene had at one time occupied what we would call the Knights of Columbus Hall. There was a house on that site that was known as the Kramer Homestead, and was occupied by an elderly woman named Catherine Kramer. And when she died, the congregation began using that house as a place of worship, and eventually were able to build the brick building that exists there now. And when they outgrew that and built their modern building on High Street on the corner of High and Browse, the Knights of Columbus, which had been established in 1949, took over that building as their hall, and of course have just recently in the past year have modernized it greatly also. But a lot of different things will help to point out the history of a different, oh, there's one little thing. I like this.
Okay, do you want me to hold
Yes,
it? Or?
if you would. Now this is from the good ladies of the Methodist Church, from their missionary circle. Methodists have always been very missionary-minded, and in fact I'm proud to serve on the Missions Commission of that church. But this is an invitation to a tea that was hosted by Mrs. W.S. Hostetler, whose husband was editor of the newspaper, and whose home the tea was held at, well, what's the preposition in it, on the corner of Humboldt and Broad Street, that was later identified with Joe Bender and also with Mrs. Frank Sinks as the hostess. But if we can take a look at what it says there, it says, "You may bring a bit of sewing to our missionary tea and enjoy a pleasant hour with the society. We will try to entertain you. Among other things you'll find a sip of tea, a program. That's what we have in mind. But if perchance you can't be here, won't you please let us know? We'll ask someone to take your place, because we need the dough." Kind of to the point.
Okay, yeah, right, to the point there. Exactly.
But some churches have actually published history books. These are some of them we might just take a real quick look at. This is
here.
one of the first Mennonite church, Wadsworth. Now, after they had occupied that building, the former Congregationalist Church, until 1959, again they outgrew the home, and they built the beautiful modern building on Treese Road. And the future of that historic building, which incidentally is the only building in Wadsworth on the National Register of Historic Places, was uncertain, and it was planned to tear it down for a parking lot. When in doubt, plow it under. It's kind of Wadsworth's motto with things like that. But luckily, architect Gady from Cleveland, who was on the Historic Review Board at that time, was contacted, and through his efforts they were able to preserve the church, and the Episcopal congregation took it over as their home and have been there ever since, thankfully for us.
Okay, here we have what, another story of...
Now this is a history. We have three different groups of Mennonites in this area. We have the First Mennonite Church, then we have the Bethel Mennonite, and all three groups that exist within this area come from common roots, but they have different beliefs
Beliefs,
within their
right.
denomination.
Mhm.
But this history, which was written in 1982 by Anna Lois Rohr, gives a history of the Mennonites in Medina County, and it's a very, very interesting book.
Okay.
Now, this technically is out of the bounds of Wadsworth. It's into Seville, but the Jerusalem Lutheran Church its ties are so close to Wadsworth that we feel as though it's part of our community. And most people, if the name Jerusalem Evangelical Lutheran Church isn't immediately familiar, most people around here would call it the Acme Church, or the Acme
yeah,
Lutheran.
that's right. That I recognize.
And that's a history that was written at the time celebrating their 150th anniversary.
Okay.
And this is a book of the Grace Lutheran Church. Now, I didn't bring their history book today. I had loaned it to someone, and I didn't have it at the house. But this is just a book dealing with the history of their windows,
Oh.
which are fantastic.
They're beautiful. Oh, absolutely. They're wonderful.
And this is the first of 2 volumes of the history of the Methodist Church, which you probably gathered from the picture
Yes.
on the front.
But if you didn't see that picture, you wouldn't quite know what church this was from.
Well, this was written by Marion Kuntz Hinkle,
Mm-hmm.
who was a longtime Wadsworth school teacher. And we visited her farm during our tour around last year across from the high school. And she penned this book a few years back, taking us up to the time of the 1903 building. And then just this year was published the 2nd volume, which brings us all up to date.
And today here. I'll get this on.
And
oh,
I think
see, so there you have the other.
buildings.
Yeah.
But these histories, even if you're not a member of the particular congregation, I think a person would find them interesting.
Well, when you say this brings us up to date, this also brings us to about an hour
Oh,
of church information, and I know that you have additional information, and I was wondering if I could persuade you perhaps to come back with the rest of the information, also a clip that I know you were going to show.
sure. We can
And we
finish up
can-
with this another time.
Exactly, and I know you probably have more pictures still at home of other churches that you were being very frugal and not bringing, so maybe you could get together some more of those pictures too.
That would be fine.
Okay, thank you, David, very much.
You're welcome.
And thank you for watching In Touch. And if you have any additional information that you would like to give to David, if you have some brochures or other church information, just you could drop it off here at the studio, which some people have already done in the past, or drop it off at his house. I know he'd appreciate it. Am I saying that right? Maybe your mother won't, but you will. Thank you for watching.